I think the main lesson that we should learn from Imperial Germany is just how fragile democracies are, really. There's been this idea that Germany was already a dictatorship before 1914 and it went into the war as such. When in actual fact, in 1914, Germany was one of, well, certainly it had democratic elements in its system. I wouldn't say it's a complete democracy, but nonetheless, it had the largest social democratic party in the world, and it had a parliament that gave as good as it got. It was confident to fight back against the Kaiser. And then when war breaks out, it just rolls over to a military dictatorship, and we should be asking why. It's not a natural process that just happens, but it happened because people were almost willing to give up that democracy at that point in time. And there are lessons in that, I think, as modern states we ought to look at. This idea that democracies are just a fact of life in the Western world and they'll always be there, I think is a dangerous thought. And we need to look at democracies more closely and look after them rather than just taking them for granted. I think Kaiser Wilhelm II was a hugely ambiguous figure. It's easy to see this sort of childlike, naive, eccentric man as somebody who just sleepwalked into a war that he never really anticipated or understood. I mean, when he finds out that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated, which is now widely regarded as the trigger for the First World War, he decided to go off on his annual cruise to Norway, on his holiday cruise in any case, packed up his 2 dachshunds and his bag, and off he went for 4 weeks. And you just wonder how much you can misjudge the sort of magnanimity and complexity of that crisis that was unfolding at that time, and that he, as the head of state, should have perhaps been there and overseen. And yet there's also a darker and competitive and very militaristic side to him that certainly desired in part to see the European nations pitted against each other, to see how Germany would fare in such a context. Given that the royalty in Europe was so heavily connected, the Russian Tsar and of course the English monarch, they're all cousins with the Kaiser as well. And so this idea that they're competing against each other, I think, was there. And it's the destruction and death and misery that competitive streak caused that I personally just cannot forgive Wilhelm for. I think the most interesting character in the history of Imperial Germany, for me personally, is Käthe Kollwitz. She's just such a fascinating woman. Her art, I think, gave a voice to the experience of so many that still echoes through the ages and makes their experiences real in a way that I think pieces of paper can't. And I think the most poignant sort of aspect of her own history for me would be the fact that her son Peter basically came back from holiday early in August 1914 because he wanted to go off to fight. But because he was technically still underage, he had to ask his mother's and father's permission to be able to sign up as a volunteer. And Käthe reluctantly agreed that her son should have the right to fight for his country and do his duty in the way that most other Germans were. But his father was very, very reluctant to let him go. And they argued and they bickered and they shouted at each other over the dinner table. And Käthe, in the end, with a heavy heart, went to her husband and convinced him that Peter does need to go if he wants to go. And both of them signed that piece of paper in the end and allow him to sign up with his friends. So they all go and have basic military training. And are sent off to the front lines within a matter of weeks. And 2 weeks after Peter had gone, his mother received her own postcard that she'd sent him back, and it just said on it, "Return to sender, dead." And that sacrifice that she made haunted her for the rest of her life. She didn't see why Peter had to die. She didn't understand what that sacrifice was for, and that guilt is really reflected in her art, which almost obsessively dealt with motherhood afterwards, and this is something that really stuck with me. I personally think Otto von Bismarck was a genius. I have memories of sitting in a dingy schoolroom at the age of 14 and just sort of frowning at a complicated diagram that the teacher had drawn up on the board to try and show us the intricacies and complexities of Bismarckian foreign policy. And I thought then the man is brilliant. But I don't think my views are necessarily representative of all people in Germany. There's certainly recently been an attempt to try and sort of draw almost like a straight line from 1871 and Bismarck's constitution then to the Germany of the 1930s and 1940s. And that straight line, I think, is wrong. It doesn't work that way. Bismarck did not set up a dictatorship and certainly not fascism and genocide and war in 1871. And my book, to some extent, certainly sets out to rescue Bismarck from that particular ignominy.